Hi everyone, Alex Absalom here, and we are continuing our little series on learning about spiritual warfare through Paul's teaching in Ephesians chapter 6. Now, last time we left it, we were thinking about how far are we willing to go in our struggle, the wrestling against the spiritual forces of evil, which are around us, both personally and also in society and culture. Today, what we want to think about is the fact that as Christians, we are called to be on the offensive when it comes to spiritual warfare. So here's how this works. Armor is put on by a soldier headed into a fight, and that armor is going to equip them so that they're able to face both defensive and offensive scenarios. Now, what a lot of people will say, I've heard this preached, you may have heard it as well. They'll say something like, these pieces of armor that Paul describes, they're basically defensive. They're just to kind of help the person not get overwhelmed, just to kind of circle the wagons, hold the ground. I want to say that is nonsense. That's not what this text is actually saying at all. Paul is not primarily thinking of defensive protection. Instead, what he's thinking mostly of is that we are called to drive back the enemy and to enforce the victory that Jesus has already won. So he says this, the phrase is, after you've done everything to stand. After you've done everything to stand, that's verse 13. So literally, the Greek is, after you have conquered completely to be standing. So Paul says, after you've conquered completely, I want you still to be standing. So and the picture there is of celebrating a victorious battle, a great triumph over the enemy. So after you have done, after you is the word that NRV uses, or after you've conquered completely, that's actually just one word in Greek. And it means to overpower or to subdue or to prevail against. One commentator, Ed Murphy, puts it like this. I'll read this quote to you. A warrior who never attacks the enemy but only defends himself is a trapped warrior. An army that only defends but never attacks is unfit for war. A church which does not reach out to war but only stands and defends itself is already defeated. In spiritual warfare, the best defense is to go on the offense. I think he's right. We see this, for instance, with the idea of the shield. So just to be clear, when Paul was writing the spiritual armor, he was decent chance he was in jail, either chained to a Roman guard, or he would have seen a lot of Roman soldiers around him. So he knows their weapons and their armor well. So he talks about the shield. And the Roman shield was basically a long rectangle, about 4 foot long, 2.5 feet wide. And it was designed for the Roman wedge, which was a key battle maneuver they had. It was a tactic that actually allowed them to dominate battlefields for centuries. And so what happened was each legionary had his shield. 2/3 of that shield covered himself. 1/3 of his shield covered the man to his left. And so this created this super tight formation. It was a shield wall, and that was almost unbreakable. And then between the different shields, there's just enough room where you could get your sword out and poke it through, and you would stab and kill the enemy. So hence the Roman sword in that scenario is kind of fairly short. It's not a really long one because it's a more kind of thrusting, stabbing movement it's doing. And this enabled Romans, when they took up this shield position, shields in front of them, shields on top of them, they would just relentlessly roll forward, mowing down the enemy and win battle after battle. There's an early church leader called Chrysosotum who was very familiar with the tactics of Roman legions, and he wrote this: the very first feature in tactics is to know how to stand well. Many things will depend upon that. So what he wants us to understand is that this repeated command we've read in Ephesians 6 to stand firm is not a passive waiting, but it's more like us saying today, more like us saying to someone, hey, move onto your front foot. So if we're to be effective in spiritual warfare, we have to move ourselves, shift our weight, shift our posture and our mindset to be on the front foot in order to move forward effectively against the enemy's schemes. And so in light of that, in light of this need to be on the offensive, to be moving forward, Paul then begins to list a number of pieces of spiritual armor. Now, like all lists that Paul produces in the New Testament, it's illustrative rather than exhaustive. So don't be constrained by the examples that he gives. In fact, he himself, he describes spiritual armor in different ways in other places. So, for instance, in 1 Thessalonians 5:8, he talks about faith being instead of a shield, it's now a breastplate. He portrays love as a weapon. He says the helmet of salvation also includes hope, and so on. So he kind of was quite happy to mix it up a bit as well. So I just want to encourage you not to be restricted by the examples, and we'll perhaps talk about that next week in our final session. But for now, I want to give you some practical next steps to take away from what we've talked about today. So 3 questions for you. Number 1, do you think of spiritual warfare more in terms of being on the defense or on the offense? Question number 2, where specifically do you need to move onto your front foot when it comes to spiritual warfare? And then number 3, what would your city or your wider community look like if in your church there was the spiritual equivalent of a strong shield wall, or the Roman wedge, steadily moving forward against the enemy? What would that look like? What difference would that make in your city? How might you see that start to come about? So there's some questions for application. Love to go away, think and pray about those, and join me next time for the final part in this series from Ephesians 6 on learning about spiritual warfare.